Every year, I get a ton of questions from viewers about child seats. So in this episode, we're going to take a deep dive into the subject. We're going to talk about the different kinds of child seats, what you need to know if you're car shopping and you're expecting at the same time so you can make sure your car will fit your child, not just when they're first born, but of course through every stage in their life until they can actually sit in a regular seat. So let's just dive into the topic with the general types of child seats out there. At the beginning stage, we're going to have basically a child seat like this, or most likely a child seat like this. This is an infant seat. It basically handles your child. I have one here without a child in it, which is handier. This one is rated for a child between 4 and 35 pounds. Especially if you have a preemie, you're probably going to want to go for a seat like this. Also, if you want to be able to take your kid out and carry them around, lock them into a compatible stroller, that's what these little hooks on the side are for, you're going to want an infant seat right like this. Now when your child is at their smallest, they will end up with a little booster cushion on the bottom to help prop them up and get them into a position where the shoulder belts will actually be able to keep your child safe in the seat. It's always important to remember to follow all the instructions for the car seat and for the vehicle you're installing the car seat in. And if you have any questions, be sure and contact a certified child seat installer. To be technical here, and we really ought to be since we're talking about safety, what you want to find is a child passenger safety technician, CPST or CPS technician. There is for some reason a pervasive thought that every fireman out there is a CPST. That is not the case. Some may be, most are not. So you want to make sure you find a certified child passenger safety technician if you want assistance in installing a child seat properly in your vehicle. But it's really not rocket science. Basically what we're trying to do here is make sure that in an accident your child is properly restrained in the vehicle. And there are two components to that. There's obviously getting your child safely belted into the child restraint itself, and then there is connecting that child restraint to the vehicle. So with that out of the way, let's get back to the different kinds of seats. So again, weight range of this seat, 4 pounds to 35 pounds. So relatively narrow compared to this guy here, which is a convertible child seat. The big thing here is that you have one seat that can go rear facing or forward facing. This one is suitable for rear facing between 5 and 40 pounds. So more weight than that seat, of course, but it starts at 5 pounds, not 4 pounds. So again, preemie babies, things like that. Forward-facing, 22 to 65 pounds. And you can get rear-facing seats now, rear-facing convertible seats that are suitable for rear-facing up to 50 pounds. The current recommendation, obviously this is up to you as a parent, but the current recommendation from most of the pediatric associations out there is that you set your child in rear-facing for as long as possible. And that could mean up to 50 or 60 pounds depending on the rating of your child seat. Now, at this point in time, I intend to do that with my daughter here, but let's just say that's a long way away. So who knows how that will go over time. After this seat, you will probably end up in some sort of booster seat for a while. Either a high back booster seat or simply the booster bottom cushion. This one is convertible, so you can actually remove the high back if you want to do that. There is also a 3-in-1 seat. So that basically is going to function like this Kiko child seat over here, except that it's also going to have a booster mode. So theoretically, you could get away with just one child seat. I think in a rational world, a 3-seat setup makes the most sense because you can, again, carry your child around in this thing if you want to. And then you can move into a forward-facing, rear-facing seat here where they're still rear-facing, but they're finally at an age where they can get in and out partially by themselves because this is really bulky and pretty heavy. Then, of course, you're going to end up in the booster seat until they can actually have that shoulder belt, the lap and shoulder belt in the vehicle, properly restrain the child on its own. And the reason we want that booster seat there is because you want to make sure that shoulder belt is hitting the child properly across the chest. It's all about managing the loads in an accident. Now, speaking of managing the loads in an accident, we're going to talk about installing child seats a little bit later here, but let's talk about the basic ways you can install a child seat. You can use the lap and shoulder belt with any of these devices around here, including this base station that's lurking in the shot. But you can also use latch anchors with everything here except for these infant seats in their own right. If it's just an infant seat like this, without the base station, then you have to use the lap and shoulder belt. There is a lot of question and a lot of commentary circling around what is safer, lap and shoulder belt or latch anchors. And I guess I should just take a dive into this. I will say that there are a very limited number of European car seat manufacturers that have said publicly they believe latch anchors are safer intrinsically. Most of this really just comes down to, is the seat properly installed? And basically every car seat company in the US says if the car seat is properly installed, they are equally safe. But you must choose one or the other. You're not supposed to latch and shoulder belt the child seat in at the same time. Reasons for that I don't fully understand, but if anybody from those child seat companies can reach out, let us know. Just bottom line, don't do it. Now, the reason I find latch anchors to be better is because it's easier to get a more consistent attachment, and that really was their function. Because with a lap and shoulder belt, like we'll talk about when we install these in the car, you're going to have a path that differs from one seat to the other. In this seat, the lap belt goes over this part of the seat, and the shoulder belt goes around this little blue tab here. So they're color-coded so you know where the belts go. But snugging it in the vehicle and making sure that it's not moving around is a lot harder than a base station like this guy right here. But you will notice this base station also has blue bits, and that's because this can also be installed with the lap and shoulder belt. It would actually go under this little latch section right there. We'll obviously go into that as well. Now, the reason I picked this particular infant seat for my child is because it has a rarity in North America. It has a load leg. The function of this is to make sure that the child seat doesn't wobble in the vehicle in the event of an accident. Because if this is in the seat, right like that, then it can't go down in the event of an accident. It can't submarine. It also adds some extra weight so that way it's not going to pop up quite as much as perhaps it could either. But if everything is installed properly, there's a lot of force on the back of the seat, on the seat back cushion, and it's not really going to be moving in that direction anyway. Seats like this, or base stations like this, also may have a little level. It's a bit difficult to see here, but there's a level here, so if your vehicle is on a level surface, you can see the angle of the appropriate child seat install in the vehicle based on your child's weight. And you would use a little knob there to actually move this little slide around based on how heavy your child is. Child weight is important to remember because latch anchors have a weight limit. Shoulder belts do not. So the lap and shoulder belt, you could take your kid all the way up to adult, adult 180-pound person, 180-pound device, strapped into the seat, totally safe. Latch anchors are rated only to 65 pounds, and this is a common misconception. It's not 65 pounds of the child, it's not even 65 pounds of my daughter in this seat here, which is getting a bit heavy. Let's see what we have here, because I do have a scale, so we can talk about this properly. So right now, this combo is 17.1 pounds, and over here, the child seat, identical one here, alone is 7.7 pounds. So we got about 10 pounds of kid there. But that's not the measurement that's important because that child is latched into a base station. So the weight limit actually includes the base station as well. So it's the child, the seat, the base station, anything that is attached by latch anchors in the vehicle. And this combo is 30 pounds. So surprisingly, already halfway to the latch anchor limit, even though she's not terribly old at the moment. So let's scoot that off to the side. It gets more critical though when we're talking about all-in-one or convertible seats. She's actually being really good now, not crying at the moment, because this Kiko convertible seat, in case you're wondering that's how you pronounce it, it is Kiko. This seat is rated for 60 pounds? What did I say here? 65 pounds forward-facing, 40 pounds rear-facing, but it weighs 17.6 pounds in its own right. So your child, once they go forward-facing, you really can't use the latch anchors for too long. You've only got a few pounds of leeway. Now, speaking of anchors, those have changed quite a bit over the last few years, and this has one of my favorite style of anchors on it. Previously, most latch anchors looked like this. Maybe a little bit difficult to see on camera, but basically there's a little springy bit of metal there and it operates kind of like a carabiner. You just latch it onto whatever you're latching it onto. But over time, we have started to see newer, and I would say better designed latch anchors like this guy right here. It has this rigid section, a release button right there like a seat belt, and then a toothed sort of claw right there that latches onto that anchor. So for deeper set latch anchors in a vehicle, especially for removing them when you don't need them anymore, this is a lot easier because you simply push it into place, it latches in, and then you push that button to release it. So it's really, really simple. I also really like this particular widget here, which apparently is patented, so you don't find on too many seats out there, but this makes it a lot easier to get a secure latch anchor installation. Here's what's going on. It's basically a tackle block, I guess, for lack of a better term here. We have 3 belt sections because it loops around. So you tighten it up with the normal buckle on this side, and then on this side, they call it the super cinch, you basically pull this and it really pulls that latch anchor in tight. It allows you to multiply the force, just like a block and tackle, same principle there, and really snug the seat in nicely. Then, of course, we have rigid anchors, which are getting more popular in the US. They have been pretty popular in Europe for a while, and we see definitely on a lot of base stations like this, or most base stations really. The function is really similar to those other anchors, except they're fixed in place in the seat right like this. And to make installation easier, they basically latch in right like that until the car seat is in place. Then you push a button here, and then you can actually ratchet this down, and it's a one-way ratchet. So to release it, you kind of reverse the process and pull it out, but basically they ratchet in right like that. And of course they close in for easier storage as well. With my previous warnings about the maximum weight of the child and child seat combo, you might be wondering why a booster seat would have a latch anchor. That's because this is the exception. You can latch anchor this into place, but the latch anchor is not supporting the child. You notice this doesn't have any seat belts of its own, like we do find in the convertible seat, the all-in-one seat, the infant seat, etc. These are just holding the seat in place. And that's absolutely not a problem to use the latch anchors for that particular purpose. You can use it to just keep it in there so that way it's not flopping around when the kid's not in it. That makes a great deal of sense. But then we have the belt paths on either side indicated in orange in this particular seat to make sure that the vehicle seat belt is properly located for the child that's actually anchored into that seat. So that's the one exception for the latch anchor. Now let's get into some vehicles and talk about anchor points. This is what a latch anchor looks like. You can see it's right there between the seat bottom cushion and the seat back cushion. We have the Latch logo there so you can identify it easily. Sometimes it may say Latch, sometimes it may say ISOFIX. Most vehicles are going to have 2 in the second row. We also have top tether anchors. I've removed the head restraint here so you can see what's going on. This is to keep the seat from flying forward in a forward-facing position. So that's when you use that latch anchor. You don't use that for a rear-facing seat. Generally speaking, SUVs, minivans, and hatchbacks will have their top tether anchor back here on the back of the second row seat back. So you do have to kind of fish it over that seat back, and in the center seat position, sometimes it can be even lower. So in this Volvo, for instance, it's right down there underneath that ski pass-through. Moving over to this Volvo C40, we find another common latch anchor location, which is behind a little plastic door. I dislike these because the plastic doors can break off if they're not easily removable, and they can also get lost. You'll notice that the latch anchor is also pretty deep in there. It's actually maybe about 2 inches or so in there, so some of those older style latch anchors are going to be a little bit more difficult to use with this, but the rigid style anchors or the new ones with that push button, those are going to be pretty easy. In the rear seat footwell, we find a very unusual anchor point for North America. This is going to be more familiar to Europeans. This is a top tether anchor for a rear-facing child seat. Getting a child seat in the US that supports this top tether anchor location, however, is a bit tricky. So do not just grab any old child seat, stick it in your Volvo, and then top tether it right here for rear-facing. You want to make sure that the vehicle and the child seat agree that you can use those attachment points. And again, keep your child's weight range in mind and all the instructions for the seat, because you will notice in rear-facing, it says you can only latch install this seat with a child rear-facing up to 35 pounds of child weight, because they're accounting for the weight of the seat. But it's different for forward-facing. This one says your child can be latch anchored into this seat forward-facing up to 40 pounds. So always, always remember to read the instructions for the seat, read the instructions for the vehicle, make sure that everything is working together. Pickup trucks are accounting for an ever-increasing share of the American vehicle market, and they present a unique challenge when it comes to top tethers in the back seat, because generally speaking, the window is really close to the rear seat back, and different truck manufacturers go in different directions for the top tether anchor. Some put the top tether behind a fold-forward rear seat back, like we see here in these video clips of a Nissan Frontier and, of course, the Ford Maverick. This can be challenging because in order to get this tight, you have to be able to pull the strap up while the seat back has been relatched back in place, and you're trying to get in the vehicle and tug on that top tether anchor strap to get it as tight as possible. The most popular trucks in America, the half-ton trucks like the F-150, Ram 1500, and Silverado 1500, generally employ some sort of loop tether. This is where it's important to consult the owner's manual of your vehicle. But generally speaking, here's how loop tethers work. There is one of these loops positioned behind each of the rear seat positions, but you don't anchor directly to the one behind the seat you're trying to put your child seat in. You actually pass the top tether anchor through the loop in the center or in the side, and then you actually connect it to one of the other loops on the other side. That's how you get the distance required for the buckle arrangement to actually tighten up. Now, there is a little bit of a twist there, and I think a better twist in GM's vehicles, where you pass it through a loop and then you actually latch to a metal rigid anchor on the back. But again, check with your instruction manual because these things do change over time, and not every truck is going to be like the one you last owned. There are a few vehicles out there like this Odyssey that have 3 complete sets of latch anchors. So as you can see, this center removable section actually has its own set of latch anchors, and they can all be used at the same time. So 3 car seats can be back here latch anchored into place as long as they'll fit, of course. A bit more common is a 5th anchor in the rear seat back. So as you can see in this Subaru Forester, we have one right there in the middle seat. It is positioned to be used with this anchor over here on this side. So that seat would fit a little bit askew, not quite in the center of the rear, and that means you would not be able to use a child seat dock or base station with a load leg because of that driveline hump and exactly how that load leg would interact with the seat not really being in the center of the rear seat back. It's important to know that in the Forester, just like pretty much every vehicle out there with 5 lower anchor points in the rear seat back, you are not supposed to use that common middle anchor point for 2 child seats at the same time. So you can either put the seat in the center or in the outboard position. You cannot put 2 seats right next to each other and use that common anchor point for both, because the weight load of those child seats would exceed that tether's capability. This also brings us along to the practice of borrowing latch anchors. That's the term if you were to try and put a child seat in the center position and then use those lower anchors, of course, on either side. This may be allowed by some child seats, and it may be allowed by some vehicles, but the list is incredibly small. So generally speaking, this should not be done. Of course, if the child seats manual and the car's manual both allow it, then you can go ahead and do it. But generally speaking, this is not something that you should attempt. The reason for that is the latch anchor standard has an 11-inch distance from one anchor to the other. And if you spread them apart and plug them into these 2 inboard latch anchor points, depending on the dimensions of the rear seat back, they can be splayed quite far apart. And that's going to present forces on the child seat differently than it was designed. And of course, if you have a child seat with rigid anchors, it's just not going to fit at all. It would have to be the flexible anchor type. And again, the vehicle and the manual for your child seat would have to agree that this is an allowable practice. Let's talk about the basic do's and don'ts for installing child seats, starting with this base station here. This again has rigid style latch anchors, so you basically just aim it for the anchor points there, if I could find that one on that side, and then you just push it in. You then use the latches to allow it to start ratcheting into place. What I find is the easiest with this style of base to avoid loose installations, which I definitely see a lot out there, friends and family, is you can rock it back and forth like this. And you want to be relatively aggressive because you want that seat, that base station, to be latch anchored as tightly in as possible. You don't really want any motion if you can avoid it. And that's part of what this leg is for. That leg goes down to the ground, and you want to make sure you follow all the instructions for your particular child seat, any indicators that indicate when something is properly or improperly installed. Again, don't use the latch anchors and the lap and shoulder belt, but let's talk about that lap and shoulder belt for this particular seat. For that, you would push those all back in, pop up this little section here, and then you wrap that belt through the blue guides like that. And then for this one, you then put the shoulder belt back through that other side. Then you engage the ratchet mechanism. So you pull it all the way out, let it all the way back in. This is a bit trickier to get a tight install because you're gonna then have to muscle this into the seat basically, like that. Let the ratchet take up the slack. Then for this seat, it has a tightening mechanism. Push that back down and lock it. It now has much more motion, you'll notice, than if I had latched it in with the latch anchors. So that's why I prefer that particular method. But obviously, if you want to put this in the center seat position, that's the only way to go. And of course, the manufacturer says that it is equally safe with either attachment mechanism as long as it's done properly. Convertible seats like this can be a bit trickier because there's a lot more adjustment going on in order to take a child from 5 pounds up to 65 pounds forward facing and rear facing. And that's why we find in a lot of seats something along these lines. Basically, a place where you have to move that latch anchor to go from rear facing to forward facing. So you slide it up there once your child has gone across the weight range. We then have a little level here so that way you can make sure that the seat is at the proper angle, and then a way to change the recline of the seat both in forward facing and in rear facing. We also have that top tether anchor dangling there that you are not going to use with this seat in North America, even if you had something like that Volvo, because this seat is not designed for that. That's only for forward facing. You would then use these latch anchors in very much the same way as that other seat, but it's kind of flopping around everywhere. So you fish around for it here. It's probably easier if I was outside the car, but basically just get that in there. Get this other one here. And then you just start yanking on the ends to tighten up the seat. Again, probably easier if I was out of the vehicle. This would be very similar in every other seat out there, but this is why, again, I kind of like this, what they call this super cinch on this particular seat, because I think it does really make seat installation easier. And this kind, you kind of have to really yank and then just muscle it into place. And now the seat is relatively tight. But you'll notice it definitely has a bit more rebound motion in that direction, especially this direction, than the model with the load leg. That's kind of why I prefer that particular seat design. Now, if you want to know about crash tests in child seats, there are a number of resources. We'll put them down there in the link description section of this video, so you can go ahead and check those out. That is one of the reasons that I ended up with the particular infant seat that I got. So let's talk about forward-facing install now. This is perhaps the area where I've noticed that people tend to get a little bit lazy over time, especially if you're trying to move child seats from one vehicle to the other. If you're really torn, I strongly recommend that you get multiple base stations, multiple different child seats for the different vehicles that your kid's going to be in. If you're a 2-car household, get 2. And that way you can just go from one vehicle to the other. I actually have 3 base stations for my infant seat because I find it a lot easier just to make sure we have a spare for cars that we're reviewing, for our regular cars, etc. But these bigger seats, they're definitely a bummer to pull in and out. And then in the forward-facing position, sometimes it can be a bummer to really get them tightly in the vehicle. And here's what I recommend in this instance. If you can get entirely in the vehicle, if that front seat is moved far enough forward, then you can really get in here like this, put your knee in the child seat and really make sure that you get it in there nice and tight. In most vehicles, I recommend removing the rear head restraint before installing the top tether anchor. It's going to make it easier. Also, run that top tether anchor underneath the head restraint over there to the latch anchor in the back. Unless you're not getting a good connection, then just give up on your head restraint. Know that it's going to be crinkled like a little pretzel and run it over the top so you can actually cinch the seat down. The point of the top tether anchor is to keep the car seat from doing this in the event of an accident. And you don't really want it to move much at all. So if the child seat is moving more than about a ½ inch in any direction, it should be tighter in the vehicle. It should be really firm in the seat. Where should you put the child seat is definitely a divisive question, and there are a lot of variables here. Without a doubt, the center seat position is the safest in an accident, but you'll notice that most vehicles do not have a latch anchor in the center. And for ease of install and making sure that that seat is firmly installed, especially with a base station like this, I find latch anchors simply a lot easier. You can, of course, safely install it with the lap and shoulder belt And in this vehicle, that's pretty easy because the lap and shoulder belt are relatively well centered, but not always. You'll notice actually that the center seat belt buckle is a little bit tight here, so there can be a little bit more motion in this K4 than in some vehicles that have a wider rear seat back. You may have noticed that I tend to put my daughter behind me driving the vehicle. There are a few reasons that I do that and some reasons this may not work for you. I live in a rural area, I work in suburbia, and I never parallel park. So there's never a time where I'm trying to get my daughter in and out of the vehicle in traffic, like you would in a parallel parking situation. If you parallel park, obviously this side is going to be the safest. But for me, that means that I would have to walk around to the other side of the vehicle, and that's just a little bit of a hassle. I also find that if my daughter is behind me, I can't see her, so I'm not going to be tempted to turn around and look and see what's going on if she's crying. If it's a real cry fest, you pull over and you deal with it, and I find that less distracting and a bit safer, because if I'm distracted as a driver, obviously it's not going to be as safe for her. But whatever works for you is probably the best idea. And the best idea is also put the child behind the shortest person up front. So if you or your spouse or your partner or whatever is the shorter one, it should go behind that seat because you are going to get a bit more clearance. But this works for me and for my family. The center seat position can also be tricky in that instance because remember, we need clearance between the front seat back and the child seat. And if you put the child seat in the middle and one of those seats is further back, guess what? It can be impacting that child seat right there. Then of course, there's actually getting the child and the child seat into the center seat position, which is tricky because, of course, you know, they get heavier as they get older, and you're having to heave this across the interior into this position. Now, safety and accident statistics-wise, I have not been able to get really good data on this, but I have spoken to some friends that work for the IIHS, the Institute for Highway Safety, and they said that even though accidents are more common on the driver's side, passenger side accidents are statistically deadlier, and that's because of T-bone style accidents where you're turning left across an intersection. This is actually going to be a little bit less safe, even though accidents are a little bit less common. So I think it's a toss-up. That's what everybody seems to tell me, is that even though accidents on the driver's side are more common, this side less common but more deadly, safest place is the center. The last consideration, of course, side impact airbags. Curtain airbags are going to come a decent way down the door. Obviously, it's going to cover all the glass area there, and you want to make sure that there's enough clearance between the child seat and that side curtain airbag so that way it doesn't like go into the child seat, anything like that. It's absolutely not a problem in this vehicle. There's a lot of clearance over here on this side, and of course, the handle on an infant seat like this, which is supposed to remain up for this particular seat while it's in the vehicle, that would also help block things like that. Thanks for watching. Hopefully that answers all of your questions when it comes to child seats and child seat safety. Again, be sure and reach out to a child passenger safety technician, a CPS technician or a CPST if you have any questions. I am not one. I have taken all the coursework, but I never did the practicum because I wasn't interested in doing that aspect of it. I just wanted to know more about it so we could create videos right like this one. The key things to remember are, again, follow all the instructions for the child seat and the vehicle you are putting the child seat in. That is especially critical when we're talking about front seat clearances to rear-facing seats like this infant seat, or of course a convertible seat as well. Because in some vehicles, especially a lot of European vehicles with anti-whiplash mechanisms, Volvo especially, those front seats can move a decent amount rearward in the event of a collision, and you don't want it to hit the child seat. Occasionally it is allowed if the child seat and the vehicle actually both agree, but it's safest to leave that extra bit of cushion there. As always, be sure and insert your burning questions down there, and we will follow up in a future video if needed. See all of you later.